Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here to address the Bruges group this afternoon and to serve as Andrew Bridgen's warm-up man. I hope I will enjoy greater success in speaking to you this afternoon than when, as the Minister of State for the Armed Forces a few years ago, as Barry kindly mentioned, I paid a visit to the headquarters of the Intelligence Corps at Chicksands in Bedfordshire. As part of my visit, I was introduced to a number of junior NCOs who had just finished what the Int Corps called a basic intelligence course. And I was chatting to one of these corporals, and I said to him, "Tell me, Corporal, what was the final exercise at the end of your course?" And at this point he looked slightly nervous, and I saw sideways glances starting to be exchanged. So I thought, I'm onto something here. So I put on my old platoon commander's voice, and I said more sternly, "Corporal, what was your final exercise?" And the chap braced up. And with the moral courage of the British junior NCO down the centuries, when talking to authority, he said the following: "Well, sir, as you asked," he said, "the scenario we were given was that you, Minayef, were visiting a police station in the West Midlands, and we received a credible intelligence tip that there was a threat to your life. So our syndicate's mission was to provide intelligence and security advice to the West Midlands Constabulary to protect you for the duration of your visit. And after the planning phase, we ran an exercise to test it." "Oh," I said, "what happened?" "You got killed, sir." "Oh," I said, "well, that's a bit of a shame." I said, "So you all failed the course?" "No, sir, we all passed." Well, I must say it's been an experience for me being in the media spotlight over the last 6 months or so. I think because of the Brexit issue, which I've not really been used to hitherto. In fact, one journalist, Matt Fry, the Europe editor of Channel 4, recently tweeted the following, and I quote Mr. Fry: "In Brussels they're learning the name Marc Francois and they're scratching their heads. But as one EU official said, at least he didn't go to Eton." I hope you got that bit, Boris. Now, Mr. Chairman, that is certainly true. I was born in 1965 in Crouch End in Islington in North London, ironically in Jeremy Corbyn's present-day constituency. I moved to Basildon with my parents in 1971, grew up on a working-class council estate, and went to what in those days was very much a bog-standard comprehensive called St Nicholas. My late father, Reginald Francois, was a war veteran. He fought at D-Day on a minesweeper called HMS Bressay, and I'm immensely proud of that. He married shortly after the war, but then divorced and remarried an Italian woman called Anna Carloni, my mother. So as an Englishman with a French surname and an Italian mother, perhaps it was always inevitable that I would become a Eurosceptic. I worked reasonably hard at school, and my great passion was history, including the history of our nation down the centuries, what Churchill famously called our island story. I went off to Bristol University in the 80s to study that, including under a wonderful tutor called Professor John Vincent, and I then took my Masters in War Studies at King's College London under Sir Lawrence Freedman, a great strategist who recently was one of the commissioners on the Iraq War Inquiry. Whilst at university, I joined the Territorial Army and was commissioned as an officer. I joined my local infantry regiment, the Royal Anglian Regiment, after graduation, and served in the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. Politically, I began my career in what was then Basildon District Council in the county of Essex. Thank you. When David Amess famously held the marginal seat of Basildon in 1992, I spent 2 years of my life running the canvass and organising David's successful defence. I spent 4 years on Basildon Council, which was a robust place in which to learn one's political trade. It was once described as, and I quote, "the only local authority in the United Kingdom where at full council meetings the councillors actively heckle the public gallery." Whilst there, I developed a certain robust debating style, which one or two people have commented on since. I then went on to fight my first parliamentary seat against Ken Livingstone, Red Ken in Brent East. I have to say that schlepping up and down the back streets of Kilburn and Willesden Green in 1995-97 in the dying years of the major government was not the easiest thing I've ever done in politics, but it did teach me a certain resilience, which I hope I've maintained to this day. One thing I do remember from those days is a very lively hustings with Ken Livingstone at Willesden Green Library. And he said something that day I've never forgotten. He said, as a Member of Parliament, a general election is a chance to commune with your 68,000 employers. Well, in my case, I currently have some 79,000 employers in Rayleigh and Wickford, but the principle is exactly the same. Those people employ me to represent them in the House of Commons, and if they ever feel that I have not taken that responsibility seriously, then I'm very conscious that they may exercise their democratic right to employ somebody else. But I fear that there are too many members of Parliament in the House of Commons at the moment who have forgotten the basic reality that members of Parliament are servants of the people and not the other way around. I was elected to Parliament in 2001 in the same intake as David Cameron, George Osborne and one Boris Johnson. I made my main speech in the House of Commons after 1 month. Now the way it works is there isn't time specifically set aside for newbie speeches, as it were, but rather you can choose the subject on which to make your maiden speech, and providing you catch the speaker's eye, you can speak in whichever debate you desire. Now, having already at that time developed some concerns about the growing power of the European Union over our national life, and as someone who was always very opposed to the Maastricht Treaty, I decided to make my maiden speech on the 4th of July 2001 against the ratification of the Nice Treaty. Now, it's often worrying when politicians start quoting their own speeches. Blair often would say in interviews, "Have I not said?" But if you'll forgive me, in this instance, I will tell you that on that night, almost 18 years ago, I said the following about our relationship with Europe, and I quote, "We are a historically tolerant people. We are willing to negotiate and to cooperate, but we will not be subsumed by a foreign superstate that ignores our traditions and undermines our laws." Mr. Chairman, that still remains my view to this very day. I was promoted to the Opposition Whip's office, where I learned some things that have come in handy recently, and I then worked on the Shadow Treasury team under George Osborne. I then joined the Foreign Affairs team under William Hague as the Shadow Minister for Europe in 2007. As a result, as your chairman has kindly indicated, I worked very closely alongside William in opposing the Lisbon Treaty in 2008. Some of you may remember William's famous speech on the second reading of the ratification bill, at which time it was rumoured that Tony Blair was on manoeuvres to become the new President of the European Council, much to the disgust of the then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. I can't really do it justice, but William's speech had the following in it. He said, "And then the awful moment, when the motorcade of the President of Europe sweeps majestically into Downing Street. The gritted teeth and bitten nails. The Prime Minister emerging from his door with a smile of intolerable anguish. The choking sensation as the words 'Mr. President' are forced from his mouth. And then once in the Cabinet room, the melodrama of 'When will you hand over to me?' all over again." After William had done the second reading debate, as the Shadow Minister of State, it fell to me to debate the hard detail of the Lisbon Treaty. I spent 14 nights in the Commons debating chapter after chapter of the 300-page treaty, as it became increasingly apparent that the House of Commons did not have the power to change so much as a single punctuation mark in the entire document. That was my epiphany. I realised at that time we no longer had control of our destiny. And so that is when I personally resolved that we would one day have to leave the European Union. We then fast forward to 2018-19 and the withdrawal agreement. In this case, a 585-page treaty, which is deliberately misnamed, as it doesn't really take us out of the European Union at all. I could go through with you in detail why that is the case. The continuing influence of the European Court of Justice in key areas of our law. The so-called joint committee, by which two unelected civil servants, in effect, have the power to make law. The arbitration procedure under Article 174, which is ultimately subject to the European Court of Justice, and of course the dreaded backstop, which would lock us into a customs union forever, with the so-called Hotel California dilemma, in which we could check out, but we could never leave. Much of the treaty was drafted by the PM's chief negotiator, Ollie Robbins, a senior British civil servant who has never accepted the result of the 2016 referendum. In praising his work in drafting a treaty to effectively keep us in, Tony Blair, that great seeker after truth himself, said in November 2018, "I take my hat off to Ollie Robbins. Ollie's a very skilled guy. The elaborate camouflage of all the different points is a tribute to the skill of the British civil service. I say that sincerely." Well, if it's said sincerely by Tony Blair, who can argue? For all these reasons, I and a number of my colleagues in the ERG have consistently voted against this treaty, as I believe it is utterly against the spirit of the referendum in which 17.4 million UK citizens voted to leave the European Union. Both the Daily Telegraph and the Sun called it a surrender. It is. But I'm here to tell you that the British House of Commons throughout its history has never surrendered to anybody, and I believe it never will. There may never be a meaningful vote for, because the Speaker has quite rightly ruled that we have already voted against the treaty on 3 separate occasions. And of course, just as with the Lisbon debates, in the course of our debates, not one single dot or comma of the treaty has been changed. Essentially, to quote the Prime Minister, nothing has changed. In other words, we voted down exactly the same thing 3 times in a row. And my message to the Prime Minister is simple. Prime Minister, which bit of no, no, no don't you understand? But even in the unlikely event of the Speaker allowing a 4th so-called meaningful vote, I still don't believe that the wretched document would pass. The so-called Spartan phalanx, and I have 2 fellow Spartans here with me, remains intact. And if anything, more colleagues who voted for the deal on MV3 are now saying they would vote against it if it ever came to MV4. So the net of all of that is that it's not going to pass. And that is something our EU partners now need to fully appreciate. They also need to appreciate that there is no majority in the House of Commons for a second referendum, which has now been voted down 3 times in as many weeks. The one potential exception to this would be if the Prime Minister's so-called cross-party talks with the Labour Party were to bear fruit. We are in the bizarre position that for 6 months the Prime Minister has been telling the ERG that the withdrawal agreement is not a customs union, but now for the last week David Lidington has been telling the Labour Party that it is a customs union. I believe, I may be wrong, that the Labour Party are unlikely to finally sign up because of the simple political maxim that oppositions generally don't come to the rescue of drowning Prime Ministers. So the Prime Minister's plan to go to the European Council with a cross-party deal already in her pocket, so far at least, has failed. We now read this morning that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has been fed into the talks, presumably to add some light-hearted humour to the proceedings, and we'll see what difference he makes. So I believe that while the Labour Party will continue to make positive noises, it is unlikely that they will finally come to a formal agreement to ratify the treaty in the House of Commons, at least not without promising a second referendum, which is something the vast bulk of the Conservative Party could never accept. Moreover, speaking purely personally now, I believe that Jeremy Corbyn will ultimately repay the Prime Minister with a vote of confidence. But that's what you get when you negotiate with Marxists. Against this background, the Prime Minister recently wrote to the European Council asking for permission to again extend Article 50 to the 30th of June 2019. This despite the fact that she made exactly the same request last time and was brutally turned down. In fact, she was even made to dine alone, something they never even did to Margaret Thatcher. An extension to the 30th of June is designed, as the Prime Minister specifically points out in her letter, to allow for the passing of the withdrawal agreement and for its subsequent ratification by the House of Commons. And because it's an international treaty, which would bind us forever in international law, we require an Act of Parliament to ratify it. That is our normal way. Now, I've not seen the so-called withdrawal agreement implementation bill, or the Wade bill as it's known in Parliament, but I'm told it's over half an inch thick, and it will therefore likely take us several months of intense debate in Parliament to ratify it. Probably about 2 years if Bill Cash gets at it. Moreover, the timetable of the 30th of June would allow for European elections to take place in the United Kingdom on the 23rd of May at a cost of somewhere around £100 million. In the Prime Minister's madcap scheme, we would elect those MEPs, but then providing we had ratified the withdrawal agreement subsequently by the 30th of June, we would then withdraw them so they would not take up their seats when the new European Parliament is actually convened on the 1st of July. Thus, in this Kafkaesque world, she would ask us all to go to the polls to vote for absolutely nothing in the European elections in May. The Prime Minister will nevertheless travel to the European Council tomorrow to plead for her extension. But in considering the European Council, in considering this, the European Council will now have to face three inconvenient truths. And now I come on to the point I really want to make to you. Firstly, for the reasons I've already given, the withdrawal agreement is unlikely ever to be ratified, and we will never leave the European Union on that basis. Therefore, the Prime Minister asking for additional time, which would include European elections in the UK, is a complete waste, as there will be nothing to ratify at the end of it. She's consistently lacked the political authority to push anything through the House of Commons on this subject, and the truth is that her authority is waning by the day. There's therefore little point in continuing to kick the can down the road and grant a further extension to allow for a ratification process that will never occur. Secondly, the Prime Minister's desperate attempt to negotiate across the aisle with Jeremy Corbyn, an anti-Semitic fellow traveller and a committed Marxist, has enraged large sections of the Conservative Party, including many of its MPs. The Prime Minister is in effect already a lame duck, having announced to colleagues she would be prepared to resign to get her withdrawal agreement through, but having been deliberately rather vague about the date. Many Tory MPs are now so angry that letters are flowing into Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers, who act as the shop stewards for the parliamentary party. More and more MPs are asking for an informal indicative vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister, which I think she would almost certainly lose. So one way or another, realistically, the Prime Minister's days are now strictly numbered, and she's likely to be replaced within a few months by a new Conservative leader. Now, under our party's rules, the MPs will hone this down to two candidates who will then go out to our 140,000 or so members in a postal ballot. In a recent survey on Conservative Home, the party's fanzine website, 72% of party members said they would now be prepared to leave the European Union as soon as possible, even with no deal. Now, such a highly Eurosceptic party membership will almost certainly pick a Brexiteer as the new Conservative leader. Be it Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab or even Jacob Rees-Mogg. And it's that person with whom the EU will need to negotiate the future relationship, but without so many fellow travellers in key positions at number 10. Importantly, just this morning, the editor of Conservative Home, Paul Goodman, himself a former Conservative MP, has publicly called on the Cabinet to persuade the Prime Minister to resign. The third inconvenient truth is that only yesterday the government laid the order in Council to begin the process of initiating European elections in the United Kingdom, which would then take place on the 23rd of May. Now, the European treaties are absolutely crystal clear on this point, that if we remain in the European Union at this time, we must, as an EU member state, elect members to the European Parliament, otherwise the whole legal legitimacy of the Parliament itself is in doubt. There are 73 UK members of the European Parliament, although those seats have already been reallocated to other countries, particularly, ironically, to Germany and France. If, however, the reverse becomes true, those seats are taken back from the other nations, given back to the UK and are effectively reinstated, if you like, then it's likely the United Kingdom will produce a very large number of extremely Eurosceptic British MEPs, the like of which the European Parliament has never really seen before. The thought of Nigel Farage and 40-plus members of his nascent Brexit party is hardly likely to warm the cockles of the hearts of the federalists in Brussels. Now, such a large group of British ultra-Eurosceptics, particularly if they were to combine with other so-called populists in the Parliament, that's the derogative term the EU use for those who don't approve of the project, would, ironically, under the Lisbon Treaty, have the ability to form a blocking minority in the Parliament, which would be capable of putting paid to the dreams of many in the EU to form a much closer federal union, which they were always ready to do, on the assumption that the UK was leaving and would no longer be in their way. In brief, therefore, as the European Council commence their deliberations tomorrow night on whether or not to further extend Article 50, I think they will need to bear all of these inconvenient truths in mind. My own take on these proceedings is briefly as follows. The British people voted to leave the European Union in a free and fair referendum. 17.4 million people so assented, with a majority of well over 1 million votes. This provides us with an opportunity to leave the EU, but to continue to trade to our mutual advantage with our European partners, with low or even no tariffs, and then to get on with our lives. Many leaders on the continent, to be fair, are also very frustrated with what you might call all of the bandwidth which has been taken up by Brexit, and they too want to get on with other issues instead. In some ways, they're as fed up with this as we are. There are many in the European Union who believe deeply in what they call the project, towards ever greater centralisation, leading eventually to a federal union. Personally, I believe this would be a serious mistake for the people of the European continent. However, as a Democrat, I respect that if that is the direction in which the European Union wishes to travel, then having left the EU, we the Brits should not attempt to stand in their way. In essence, we have made our decision, and they should be equally free to make theirs. If, however, we were to be held in the EU against our democratically expressed will, because some in the EU hope against hope that we will change our mind, then they will live to regret it. As the European Parliament's chief Brexit negotiator, Guy Verhofstadt, recently put it very well to his colleagues, be careful what you wish for. Now, it's not my intention to try and outdo Mr. Verhofstadt, but as one of Jacob Rees-Mogg's fellow officers of the European Research Group, my message to the European Council tomorrow night will be as follows. This is the 21st century, and you cannot hold a nation captive against their will. There is no point granting a temporary extension to kick the can down the road in the hope that we will finally ratify the withdrawal agreement, as we never will. If, however, you attempt to hold us in the European Union against the democratically expressed will of the British people, then in return we will become a Trojan horse within the EU, which would utterly derail all your attempts to pursue a more federal project. A new Conservative government, led by someone like Boris or Dominic Raab, might well vote down your budget, veto your attempts at greater military integration, and generally make it impossible for you to bring about the more federal project in which you so desperately believe. So in summary, in 2016 the people of the United Kingdom voted in a referendum to leave the European Union. That is all we ask. To elect our own government and to make our own laws. In short, to govern ourselves once again. We have been utterly let down by the so-called British establishment, a coterie of advisers and senior civil servants, all of whom have never really accepted the result of the referendum and have done everything in their power to overturn it. In this they've been assisted by wise fools in Parliament who think they know better than the British people and equally have done their best to frustrate our attempts to leave. But a YouGov poll in this March, said that if Britain had not agreed a deal by the 12th of April, then 51% of people are now prepared to leave with no deal. And that's up 9 points in just a few months. So frustration is growing, and it's growing fast. Now, during the referendum, the government sent at public expense a booklet to every household in the United Kingdom, in which they attempted to persuade our people to remain. In the event, they were unsuccessful. But nevertheless, the booklet did contain an extremely important pledge. I have a copy of that booklet with me here today. Some of you may remember it. Good, because you paid for it. On the last page, which is crucially entitled A Once-in-a-Generation Decision, it contains the following brief but unmistakably clear statement. This is your decision. The government will implement what you decide. Well, we decided to leave, and the sooner the better. We are currently all set to leave at 11 p.m. in 3 days' time, unless the European Council now decides otherwise. But we've already decided. We voted for it. So as I said in my maiden speech those 18 years ago, we're a historically tolerant people. We're generally slow to anger. Not for us the donning of yellow jackets and setting fire to Oxford Street. But nevertheless, we do in our very British way have a strong sense of fair play and what is and isn't right. And I believe the British people are going increasingly angry at attempts by some in their own government, in cahoots with those in Parliament and in the European Union, to essentially keep us in against our will. Ladies and gentlemen, we chose to leave. We voted to leave. So for God's sake, let's just leave! So my earnest message to the European Council is simple, and it's this. Brexit has already gone on long enough. if you now try to hold us in against our will, you will be facing perfidious Albion on speed. It would therefore be much better, for all our sakes, if we were to pursue our separate destinies in a spirit of mutual respect. As Boris Johnson recently quoted Moses' warning to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." In wondering how to conclude these remarks, I was reminded of the great words of Tennyson in his famous poem Ulysses, which could almost have been written for our current situation in this country. He wrote, "Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds. Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic heart, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Thank you.